Now what the hell do you think you're doing with that tin star, boy?
Watch that boy shit, redneck. You talking to the sheriff of Rock Ridge.
There are movies that make you laugh. And then there are movies that rewire something inside you without you ever realizing it happened. Blazing Saddles is the second kind. It has been quoted at dinner tables, dissected in film schools, and referenced in comedy writing rooms for over 50 years. Most people who love it feel like they know it completely. They've memorized the lines, they've caught the jokes, they understand the satire. Or so they think, because here's the thing about Blazing Saddles that almost nobody talks about. The most important thing happening in that film has nothing to do with the loudest moments. It has nothing to do with the campfire scene, the fourth wall break at the end, or the deliberately outrageous racial humor that had studio executives sweating through their suits. The most important thing in that film is quieter than all of that. It lives in the corners of scenes, in pauses between punchlines, in a pair of tired eyes belonging to a burnt-out gunslinger who should have been played by someone else entirely. Gene Wilder carried a secret into Blazing Saddles, and for decades, audiences laughed right past it. He finally confirmed what he had always been doing in that role, and once you understand it, the entire film looks different. Not just the Waco Kid. All of it. The comedy lands differently. The satire hits harder. And you start to wonder how a film this chaotic managed to feel so complete. The answer, it turns out, was hiding in the one performance nobody thought to look at twice. Before Gene Wilder ever set foot on the Blazing Saddles set, the role of the Waco Kid already belonged to someone else. Gig Young had been cast as the aging, world-weary gunslinger, and on paper, it made complete sense. Young was a respected Hollywood presence, an Oscar winner with real dramatic credibility. He had the kind of gravity that the role seemed to demand. He could play a man who had seen too much and lost too much and was now content to drink himself quietly into obscurity. What nobody knew, or what not enough people knew, was how serious his personal struggles had become. On the very first day of filming, things collapsed almost immediately. Young appeared on set visibly unwell. He was shaking, disoriented, and unable to hold his lines together. What some initially misread as nerves or an unconventional preparation process turned out to be something far more serious. He was experiencing acute withdrawal, and by the time the morning was half over, production had to stop entirely. Young was removed from the production, and Mel Brooks was suddenly staring at a gaping hole at the center of his film. What happened next says everything about the kind of creative relationships that produce great art. Brooks did not hold auditions. He did not call his agent or run the decision through a committee. He picked up the phone and called Gene Wilder directly. The two had worked together on The Producers years earlier, and Brooks knew what Wilder was capable of. He trusted him not just as an actor, but as a collaborator, someone who understood tone and could adapt to almost anything without losing himself in the process. What makes the story genuinely remarkable is Wilder's response. By most accounts, he did not ask for the script. He did not negotiate his fee or inquire about the size of the role. He simply said yes and got on a plane. Within 24 hours, a man who had never rehearsed a single line of the character was standing on set, jet-lagged and completely ready. And what he did with that role, in that compressed window of time, became one of the most celebrated comic performances in the history of American film. Here is the part that most people miss. The part that Gene Wilder eventually confirmed in later interviews and conversations about his career. His performance as the Waco Kid was not instinctive. It was not something he stumbled into because the role was already written that way. It was a deliberate, conscious artistic decision he made before a single camera rolled, and it went against everything the film around him was doing. Wilder told Mel Brooks that he would take the role on one condition. He was not going to play it for laughs. Read that again, because it matters enormously. In a film that was built almost entirely on the idea of going as far as possible, as loudly as possible, Gene Wilder looked at the Waco Kid and decided to play him with complete emotional sincerity. No mugging. No exaggerated expressions. No winking at the audience to signal that a joke was coming. He was going to play a real man, a damaged, exhausted, genuinely sad human being who happened to exist in the middle of an absurdist comedy. This was not a small creative choice. This was a radical one. Comedy in the early 1970s operated on very specific rules. You signaled your jokes. You performed your humor outwardly. You gave audiences the visual cues they needed to know when to laugh. Wilder threw all of that away and replaced it with stillness, restraint, and the kind of internal emotional work that you would more typically associate with dramatic roles. The result was something nobody could have predicted from the outside. Because Wilder refused to perform his comedy, the comedy became more effective. Because he refused to reach for laughs, the laughs hit harder when they came. His dryness, his pauses, his absolute refusal to acknowledge that anything happening around him was absurd, even as the film disintegrated into gloriously brilliant chaos around him, created a comedic tension that no amount of slapstick could have generated on its own. He was the still point at the center of a spinning world. And audiences laughed harder because of it. Watch the Waco Kid scenes in Blazing Saddles again with fresh eyes, and you will notice something that is very easy to miss on first viewing. Wilder is not playing a comedy character. He is playing a tragedy character who happens to be surrounded by a comedy. The Waco Kid is a man who was once the fastest gun in the West. He had a reputation, a skill, an identity built around something he was extraordinary at. And then the world around him changed, or he changed, or both, and he ended up alone in a jail cell with shaking hands and a bottle for company. The tremors are not a gag. In Wilder's hands, they are evidence of something genuinely broken. He plays the alcoholism and the physical deterioration not as punchlines but as the visible symptoms of a man who gave up on himself for reasons the film never fully explains. That deliberate ambiguity is part of what makes the performance so haunting when you look at it clearly. Wilder never tells you exactly what happened to the Waco Kid. The film never gives you a backstory monologue or a tearful confession. Instead, Wilder gives you something more sophisticated. He gives you the weight of an unspoken history carried in every pause, every flat delivery, every moment where a lesser actor would have reached for something broader and Wilder simply did not move. There is a scene early in the film where the kid describes his past, where he was the fastest draw anyone had ever seen, where crowds would gather just to watch him work. The way Wilder delivers that memory, not with pride or nostalgia but with something closer to regret, with a kind of quiet grief for a version of himself that no longer exists, is genuinely affecting. It is not a joke. It is a confession. And Mel Brooks himself later acknowledged that this dimension of the performance was not something that had been written into the script. It was something Wilder brought entirely from within himself. This is what Gene Wilder meant when he talked about playing it straight. He was not avoiding comedy. He was locating the human truth underneath the comedy, and he understood, with the instincts of a genuinely great actor, that the human truth would make the comedy more powerful, not less. One of the things that gets lost in most discussions of Blazing Saddles is how much the film depended on its working relationships, not just on individual performances but on the specific chemistry between the people making it. Mel Brooks is rightly celebrated as the creative engine of the production. His vision was singular, his willingness to go further than anyone thought acceptable was essential, and his chaotic energy drove the film forward with the kind of momentum that only genuine conviction can produce. But Brooks needed something to push against. Satire requires contrast. Absurdism requires an anchor. And the Blazing Saddles production, by multiple accounts from people who were there, found that anchor in Gene Wilder. Between takes, when the cameras were not rolling and the pressure of the production was visible on everyone around him, Wilder functioned as a stabilizing presence in ways that went well beyond his role as an actor. He was calm when the set was not. He was measured when the environment was chaotic. He worked quietly with other members of the cast, particularly younger or less experienced actors, offering the kind of subtle guidance that comes not from instruction but from example. He modeled what a grounded performance looked like, what it felt like to be fully present in a scene without trying to dominate it. Several crew members from the production have described Wilder in terms that sound almost incongruous for a comedy film set. Words like steadying, anchoring, and thoughtful come up repeatedly. In a production defined by creative risk-taking and near-constant improvisation, Wilder was the element that kept the ensemble from flying completely apart. And then, in the middle of all of this, during the downtime between setups and shooting days, something extraordinary happened on the margins of the production. Wilder started talking to Brooks about an idea. It was not a formal pitch. It was a casual conversation, the kind of thing that gets said between collaborators when the immediate pressure lifts and the mind starts to wander toward the next thing. What if the grandson of Victor Frankenstein wanted nothing more than to escape the shadow of the family name? That conversation, born on the set of Blazing Saddles during production, eventually became Young Frankenstein. Without the specific creative environment that Brooks and Wilder cultivated together on that Western spoof, one of the most beloved horror comedies ever made might not exist in any form at all. It is impossible to talk honestly about Blazing Saddles without talking about the battles that nearly destroyed it before it reached audiences. Warner Brothers executives were deeply uncomfortable with the film from the beginning. The racial satire was too direct. The language was too unfiltered. The portrayal of American institutions, law enforcement, political power, and the mythology of the Old West was not coded or gentle or designed to let anyone off the hook. The studio wanted changes. They wanted scenes softened, language altered, edges filed down until the film was something that would cause less discomfort and generate less controversy. Brooks resisted, and Wilder stood behind Brooks. This is a part of the Blazing Saddles story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Wilder was not a producer. He was not the director. He did not have the institutional power to override studio decisions unilaterally. But he had something that mattered in those conversations: credibility. After the producers, he was a known quantity, a respected creative voice whose opinion carried weight. And he used that weight to support the version of the film that Brooks was fighting to make. In private conversations and production discussions, Wilder reportedly made his position clear. The film's value came from its willingness to make people uncomfortable. Satire that hedges, that pulls its punches, that softens the very things it is trying to expose, is not satire at all. It is decoration. The racial commentary in Blazing Saddles worked precisely because it did not look away, because it forced audiences to sit with their own discomfort and examine where that discomfort came from. If the studio had won those battles, if the film had been sanitized into something more palatable, Blazing Saddles would not exist in any form that matters. It might still have been funny in a shallow way, but it would not have been the film that gets studied in universities, that gets selected for the National Film Registry, that continues to generate genuine debate about comedy, race, power, and American mythology 50 years after it was made. Wilder's quiet resolve in supporting the film's original vision was, in its own way, as important as any scene he appeared in.